Hello everyone. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you may know that I went to school in London, England, but I've never really filled you in on what my experience was really like and some of the ways that it might be different than going to school in the US, and also why it was like one of the best decisions that I've ever made in my life. So that is what I'm going to do today. So before I get into it, it may be helpful for you to know that I went to Richmond, the American International University in London. And yes, that is kind of a mouthful of a name, so I just call it Richmond University for short. And I went there for all 4 years of college, so this wasn't just like a study abroad for a semester kind of deal. This was like the real thing. Now, Richmond is a small liberal arts school with about probably less than 2,000 students. And the reason why I decided to choose Richmond over a school in the US was because I was just obsessed with anything to do with London for the longest time. Even though I'd never been in my entire life, I just kind of knew that I wanted to go at some point. I kind of just applied for fun, to be honest, because at that point I had only applied to 2 other schools. And one of the things that kind of pushed me to choose Richmond in the end was because after I got accepted, I was actually offered a pretty generous academic scholarship, and I also knew that I would completely regret not going just to at least give it a shot and see what it was like. You know, sometimes you just need to take a little leap of faith and make some spontaneous decisions in your life. So a little bit more background on the school itself. Richmond has 2 campuses, one that is obviously in Richmond, which is like the main campus, and this is where the first and second year students typically live in the dorms and take all their classes. It's kind of a smaller town within London, but a little bit further out from like the central areas like Big Ben and like the London Eye and all that. It's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful town, and the school is right next to Richmond Park, which is I think London's biggest park, but it's definitely a lot more quiet and secluded. And that campus is basically one big building that kind of looks like a castle. Kind of reminds me of like Hogwarts a little bit, which is really cool. And most of the dorm rooms and also the classrooms are basically within that one main building. Then the other part of the campus is in Kensington, which is way closer to central London and way more convenient to kind of access other parts of London. Now, the Kensington campus doesn't have any buildings that look like castles, unfortunately, but just in general, it is located in a way more convenient area. Now, without further ado, and in no particular order, I will tell you about the top things that you should know both about going to school in London and being at Richmond University specifically. Living in Kensington versus living in Richmond is honestly like night and day. Once I moved to Kensington, I was seriously so much happier. Even though Richmond is such a beautiful place to live in, it does tend to get a little bit boring after a while just because it is so much further out from central London. But I also really preferred living in Kensington because once I moved over there, I was able to live in a flat, which meant that I had a kitchen and I could buy my own groceries and cook for myself, which just seriously made so much of a difference, and I was so much happier once I had that freedom. It was also great because the flat that I was living in was right down the street from the Earl's Court tube station, which is such a great tube station to be located right next to, because from there it's so much easier to either walk or take the tube into other parts of London, whereas Richmond is kind of on like the very end of like the tube line. So the meal plan, basically I ate the same 3 things like on a daily basis, which was salads, sandwiches, and Starbucks. The school did have a Starbucks in the library, which you could use as part of the meal plan, but just overall, it wasn't great. There weren't a lot of options, and unfortunately, if you are living in the dorm, you don't have a choice to not pay for it. Obviously, you have the choice of whether you want to eat the food on the meal plan or not, but honestly, if you're living in the dorm, it really is the more convenient option, even though it's not great, unless you want to either starve or pay to like eat out at a restaurant every night. You really don't have much of a choice. You probably are aware of the stereotype that the UK isn't really known for its cuisine in the first place, but yeah, just overall keep that in mind that the meal plan doesn't give you tons of options. You may at one point have classes that are both on the Richmond campus and on the Kensington campus, and you should know that traveling between these 2 campuses can be a bit of a hassle sometimes, and you may get yourself into a situation where you have one class in Richmond and then one in Kensington like right after. It would literally be impossible to have one back to back because you can't apparate like you're in Harry Potter or something. That just doesn't happen, unfortunately. And unfortunately, your teachers will not be forgiving if you are late just because of a tube delay or just because you're running late. But luckily, London's transportation system is usually very reliable and pretty efficient. So on a similar note, you really don't have to rely on a car whatsoever. Not only is there easy access to the tube and the bus, But London in general is just such a walkable city, which is amazing. I actually started keeping track of how many steps I was taking each day, and I'm gonna brag again, but on a typical day, I would average between like 9 and 15,000 steps, depending on what day of the week it was. And honestly, for some people, it might be a lot less, especially if you're relying more on the bus and the tube, but I did make a point of trying to walk as much as possible. And honestly, in some cases, it'll save you a lot of stress because the transportation systems tend to get very packed during certain hours, and if you're claustrophobic, you may definitely prefer being out in the fresh air. Budgeting your money will be a very valuable skill that you should have, especially if you're going to be living in an expensive city like London, and also especially if you're going to be getting into the nightlife. As you may know, the drinking age in London is 18 versus 21, so especially during like the first semester, a lot of people tend to go a little overboard. Now, I don't want to risk sounding totally lame and like a grandma or something, but I was honestly never really into like the whole clubbing and drinking scene, just because after a while, I realized that I would have much rather spent my money towards something that I knew I would need. So like food or transportation and getting around London, or even putting my money towards traveling to another country. Really don't want to put yourself through that stress of checking your bank balance without knowing exactly how much will be in there first. If you get into the habit early on of just writing down everything that you spend, your life will be so much easier. The opportunities to travel are absolutely amazing and something that you should absolutely take advantage of. London is a great place to be because it's so close to other parts of Europe and it's really easy to get cheap flights. So once spring break rolls around, it's always great because there's really no better place to be when you have a week-long break. Like you can just casually say like, oh, I spent my week traveling around Italy, or I spent my week relaxing on the beach in Barcelona. Prior to coming to London for the first time, I had never been on an airplane by myself before. But once you're kind of thrown into these situations where you have to, figure out how to get through the airport or how to, communicate in a different language or figure out a whole new transportation system, it really just helps you become a lot more independent and a lot more self-sufficient. There is so much diversity both at Richmond University and in London in general. If you're like me, you may go in expecting to hear British accents 24/7, but in reality, there are like billions of different languages being spoken all at once. And also because Richmond is an American international university, it meant that there weren't just students from America, but there were people from literally all over the world, which really allows you to just kind of learn about different cultures and countries that you may not have even known existed. It may be obvious that you're not going to find any sororities or fraternities at pretty much any school in the UK, but I found that at Richmond in particular, there just weren't a ton of like clubs and groups and just general ways to get involved with the school. And that's not to say that there were no clubs and groups whatsoever, but for the most part, it just seemed like everyone kind of did their own thing. There just wasn't really that kind of feeling of school spirit that you would get at like a big US college. And finally, going to school in the UK in a whole different country meant that a lot of people at my school, especially the Americans, missed out on certain holidays, the most significant one being Thanksgiving. Honestly, that aspect was a little bit hard at first, and once I missed my first ever Thanksgiving, I had major homesickness, but it was something that I eventually got used to be honest, and the fact that we had a month-long break for Christmas kind of made up for it. If you choose to stay in your hometown to go to college, you have the freedom of going home for the weekend and seeing your family whenever you want, pretty much. But if you choose to step outside of your comfort zone and go to school in a whole different country, thousands of miles away from your family and your friends, it means that you'll miss out on certain things. But for me, whenever the homesickness hit, I just had to kind of remember where I was. Just the fact that I was in London alone was something that I was so unbelievably grateful for. So even though I wasn't able to see my parents whenever I wanted, I knew that overall it would be more beneficial for me. So those were the top 9 things that you should know about going to school in London. And I just want to emphasize the fact that even though it's a completely different experience than what you would get with a big US college, it's seriously such a valuable experience. I feel like it just made me so much more of an adult, even though I still act like a teenager sometimes, not gonna lie. I just feel like I became so much more independent and so much more able to do things on my own. Whether it was figuring out how to get from one part of London to another or from one country to another, it was just overall the best decision that I've ever made in my life. And I really can't imagine how much different my life would be if I had chosen to stay in the US to go to college. So I really hope you guys liked this video, and hopefully it helped you in some way. Even though I'm back home in the US and I've graduated from school, I feel like there's a lot more London related videos that I could probably make. So do let me know if there's anything in particular that you would like to see. And that's about it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!